Every car guy's got a story about the one that got away, and I'm about to share mine with you. This is about a Plymouth Arrow drag car, and if you watch any of my videos, you know that I'm crazy about old drag cars. And this one was basically the perfect one. It had a lot of great local history. It was a real great survivor as far as the condition of the car. It was actually a functional car, even though it did need some updates. And we're going to go into the full history on this car because I got the full story on it from the owner's family, and a lot of great old pictures of this thing as it was being built and some pictures after it was built. It went through a few different stages as most drag cars do, but there's a lot of great history here, a lot of cool stories and cool tie-ins, and a really special surprise that I didn't find out until I actually went and looked at this car. So follow along as I dive deep into the history of this home-built Plymouth Arrow drag car, and I'm going to tell you why this thing is so cool, and I'm going to tell you why I didn't buy it. So before we get too carried away with this Plymouth Arrow drag car, let's talk about Plymouth Arrows in general. Now, this car was a product of a partnership between the Chrysler Corporation and Mitsubishi. And there was lots of these things going on between American car manufacturers and Japanese car manufacturers because the Americans were needing better fuel economy. We were needing some small cars with small engines, and the Mitsubishi brand had a few good offerings. And Dodge entered into this with the Dodge Colt. That was actually a Mitsubishi car originally. And then the Plymouth Arrow came along as a 1976 model, and it was based off of the Mitsubishi Lancer. Now, these were front-engine, rear-wheel drive cars. They were very small, 92-inch wheelbase, and very lightweight. So naturally, they made good drag cars. And they were used pretty often in the pro stock ranks. So these things were very famous in the 1970s because these cars had killer stance, they had cool paint jobs, they had the engine set back with a cool scoop that went right up to the windshield. They had some really neat features that took away some of the dorkiness of the original Plymouth Arrow. So these cars made great looking drag cars, and they were all over the place in the mid-70s. But through the years, these cars have kind of gone away. You don't often see a Plymouth Arrow drag car unless it's a nostalgia pro stock car. So when this thing became available, I was instantly interested in it because I love little drag cars. Chevy Vegas, Ford Pintos, Gremlins even. There's just a lot of great opportunities with a little dorky car that you put a big motor in and go fast. And in fact, my dad had a Plymouth Arrow in the 90s, and I remember specifically riding in this car, and I thought it was the coolest thing. It had a small block Mopar in it. I don't remember the details, but a pretty basic car, had a cam, sounded good, had weld wheels on it, and it was orange. But my most fun memory of that car was riding in the very small back seat of it, and I was probably 8 or 9 years old, and me and my mom and my dad went riding around town in this Plymouth Arrow, and it was a good little hot rod. The small block Mopar that was in there was stout, lightweight car. It was a lot of fun, and we actually ended up seeing my brother while we're out cruising the streets. He was in the back seat of a Fox body Mustang, and we got to play around a little bit, just a little bit of, red light drag racing. And because of that, I always had a soft spot for these Plymouth Arrows. And even though that car my dad had was not a drag car, it did get sold to a local legend drag racer, Billy Smith, and he put a Chevrolet engine in it with a bunch of nitrous. And I've got this picture of that car. This thing's standing straight up on the back bumper. So anyways, I've got a little bit of history with Plymouth Arrows, and that definitely sparked more of an interest when this car became available. So let me tell you how this car became available to me. Every year we do a swap meet, and every year I get messages about it and people asking questions and that kind of stuff. One day I got a message on Facebook, and this guy's name is Steve Whitler, and he's a local guy. And he sent me a message about this car that he wanted to bring to the swap meet to sell. He was very quick to tell me about it, and then we got on the phone with each other, and he told me even more about it, and by this point, I'm already in love with the car. So a few days pass, and I let him know that I want to come look at this car before you bring it out to the public. And he says, sure, and I make a trip down the road. It's just like 20 minutes away from my house. And I go take a look at this car, and it is amazing. It is a really neat time capsule of a drag car. And as Steve would tell me in many conversations, both on the phone and in person, this car had a lot of special meaning to him personally. So I got to learn a little bit more about the history of the car just in our very first conversation. But the more he talked about it, the more I realized that he was right there when this car was being built. In fact, he was right there when the car was dragged out of the junkyard and brought to the guy's place to start building it. And we're going to get into the details of what this car is made of. But one thing I wanted to mention, and this was an extremely special surprise that I had no idea of until I was standing in Steve's garage looking at the car. So I had been messaging him and calling him back and forth, but obviously we didn't have like our phone numbers programmed into our phones. So I texted Steve that morning and I said, hey, this is Tommy Lee, and I was just letting you know that I was still planning on coming to look at the car. Steve's wife saw the text message before Steve did, and she looks at it and nearly hits the floor because it says, hey, this is Tommy Lee, and her dad's name was Tommy Lee. Her dad is the one that built this Plymouth Arrow. You know, that's a crazy coincidence. My name's Tommy Lee, her dad's name was Tommy Lee, and as it turns out, one of this car's previous paint jobs actually had Tommy Lee lettered on the doors. Just unbelievable. Like, this is meant to be, right? Like, I've got to buy this car. The car was priced right, the car was functional. It needed some updates, but it was functional. You could crank this thing up and it would move under its own power, which is quite a bit better than most of my drag car projects. So this thing just felt like it was meant to be. And the more I talked to Steve, the more I fell in love with this car. And once I saw it in person, I mean, you're looking at it right here, this thing is just a neat old drag car. It's got so many cool details on it. So let's get into all those details right now. So as I mentioned earlier, this car was built by a guy named Tommy Lee, but most everybody called him Bobby, so I'm going to call him Bobby in this video. So Bobby started drag racing at Brainerd Optimus Drag Strip in the 1970s, and he really got serious with the Dodge Challenger. And I've got a few pictures of this car here. It was called Stagger Lee, and you can see it's got kind of a custom wing on the back, and this thing had a small block Mopar in it. Just your typical drag car of the 1970s. And a really neat detail that's still hanging on Steve's wall in his garage is this check. And it's from the Optimus Club of Brainerd, and it's paid to the order of Tommy Lee for the amount of $100. And this is from June the 3rd, 1978. And that was with the Stagger Lee Dodge Challenger. And you can see it's sort of in this shadow box along with a few pictures of the car as well as a custom stitched racing shirt, the Stagger Lee Racing Team. By about 1980, the Challenger had really run its course with Bobby. He wanted something lightweight, something short wheelbase, something that would make better use of that horsepower, and he found that with a 1976 Plymouth Arrow. He didn't go to the used car lot and find a nice drivable one. He found one at a local junkyard, and this car had been wrecked pretty severely, and they even had to use the jaws of life to cut the person out of the car. So this thing was damaged in the front, it was damaged on the roof. It needed a lot of work, but it would make a really good drag car project. The best part about it is the car only cost him $200. And Bobby took this thing home and just stripped away everything that was unnecessary and started building his own frame. He was a welder by trade, so he was making all this stuff all on his own. And one of the neatest things that I got when I was asking about the history of this thing was a stack of pictures of it while Bobby was building the car, and even more cool than that, some hand drawings that Bobby had done to set up the four-link and do, you know, some engineering type stuff to make this car work. As he's putting this thing together, he takes the 340 out of the Challenger, the automatic transmission out of the Challenger, and the 8 3/4 rear end out of the Challenger, and he makes that driveline work in this extremely lightweight car. But the engine and transmission was relatively mild for a car of this nature. So it was a 340, a 71 model 340, had a cam, had good compression, but nothing exotic. It had a single carburetor on it, and you'll even see in some of these old pictures, he used to have a thermoquad on it. Of course, the old 340's got a set of gold anodized Moroso valve covers, a staple of any 1980s drag car. And you can see that it's got an old strip dominator single plane manifold on it, and then a Carter AFB carburetor. It's got some home-built headers on it. They're showing their age a little bit, but they still work. They're still there. And it's another piece of the history of this car. And you can see where they had to notch the windshield to clear the distributor. I love that kind of stuff on an old drag car where they had the engine set back so far that they got to just cut anything that's in the way. Here's another cool piece. On the firewall, you can see this push button, and that was to activate the starter to bump the engine around when they were setting the valves on this thing. So just another little practical detail on this thing. It didn't cost a lot of money, but it made it easier when they were setting the valves in the pits or even at home to just bump the engine around easily right there on the firewall. Inside, you can see this is all aluminum interior. This is all made from scratch. It's got a couple of new pieces in here. You can see that big monster tack. That obviously isn't original to the original build. That was added later on. But a piece that is original to the car is this Hurst shifter. Look at this console. I mean, this is straight out of the late 70s and early 80s. A really neat piece of this car's history. And check out the switch panel on this thing. This is just a sheet of aluminum that's Zeused to the transmission tunnel. And I mean, it's just got the little labels on there. It's just a cool little homemade piece that adds to this car's personality. It's just got so many cool homemade details on it. So another resourceful detail on this car is that old steering wheel that's in there. It's got those two little horn buttons. One of them, the button actuates the fan on the inside. The other one actuates the line lock. So when you're doing a burnout, you just hold that button on the steering wheel. I mean, simple stuff, but it's very practical, and it didn't require an aftermarket fancy steering wheel or an aftermarket switch. I mean, it was all wired in to the original steering wheel. Underneath the deck lid, we got more sheet metal back here. You can see where the roll cage ties into the rear portion of the frame. It's got a really tiny aluminum fuel cell on it, and that looks like that's been added at some point later on in the car's career. It probably would have had a different style or a different size fuel cell back in the day. But you can see that a lot of the pieces here are original to the car. The rear suspension, you'll see in these drawings that he made his own 4-link setup, and it's got a narrowed 8 3/4 rear end under it. He didn't put a Dana 60. Again, we're looking at efficiency, lightweight, and budget. This car was a budget build. So he put together all the suspension and chassis on this car, and it's all junkyard parts. So there's no like tubular control arms, there's no fancy aftermarket rack. This is all old stuff. But he made it all work. He tucked it all in. He made it narrow enough to fit underneath this car. Another neat detail about this car is that it was not built in some big fancy shop. It actually wasn't built in a shop at all. Bobby didn't even have a garage at all. He had a little carport on his house that they lived in since 1961. In fact, Miss Joyce still lives in that house, and it's a neat old place, but it didn't have some big fancy shop. He didn't have a lot of fancy equipment. He built this thing on pretty much a gravel driveway with not a lot of fancy equipment. So again, a home-built car, but a lot of great engineering and ideas created this really great looking piece. One thing that Bobby did is the front end and the doors on this car, so those are fiberglass, and he spent a lot of money on that because this was all brand new stuff. This isn't just used stuff that he slapped on there. This was brand new, and he got it from Thunder Fiberglass in Memphis, Tennessee. So he got the front end, he got a hood, he got the doors and the deck lid. That was all fiberglass. And he actually ended up changing the hood. The hood you see here is actually a sheet of aluminum, and the scoop is aluminum. And I mean, it is just so light you wouldn't believe it. My favorite part of this car is how that scoop goes right up to the windshield. That aluminum rectangular scoop, I mean, it's just got the perfect shape. And that takes a vision, that takes eye. So one thing that's really peculiar on the body of this car, and I mentioned that they cut the top off of it with the Jaws of Life, is that the top is actually made out of Lexan. It's actually masked off and painted, and then there's a piece of it that's left unpainted, and it's kind of like a sunroof. It's a really neat little detail on this thing. It probably isn't super safe. I'm not sure what the rules say about a plexiglass or a Lexan roof, but a really neat detail on this car that would normally go unnoticed because most of it's painted. Even though they were not installed on the car while I was there, this car does have a set of wheelie bars on it, and they're homemade. Again, really neat homemade pieces, and you'll even see here it's got a sheet metal wing on the back, and then you can see it's got a parachute. Probably didn't need it. I'm assuming this thing wasn't running 150 miles an hour, but still, it's neat when an old car has a parachute on it. Through the years, this car had a few different paint jobs. Sometimes it ran in primer, but you can see right here, this paint job, the one I'm showing you here, means the most to me because we're going to zoom in right here. Right there on the door, it says Tommy Lee. and that's my name. Again, all the feelings of this is meant to be, it's happening right here. This car used to have my name literally on the door. So even though the paint job on the car today is not that great, you can see it's got some age on it. The paint scheme itself is not all that creative. You can see it's just kind of an old school stripe. There's not a lot of action going on here, but you could very easily spice it up a little bit with a cool old school paint job. And my plan right off the bat was to buy this car and put this paint job back on it. Put that lettering back on the door, and there it is. There's my Plymouth Arrow, even though it has a completely different history going back to before I was born. So throughout the 80s and 90s, this car ran in various configurations, but it always had that 340, the same automatic transmission, the same rear end. It always had all those same pieces. And another cool detail on this car are the wheels. So the wheels on this car, they are your typical slotted mags. So you got little skinny ones on the front, like 3.5 inches wide, and you got some big 15 by 14s on the back. But the most interesting detail is that he drilled out the spokes. And I've never seen this done before. The holes between the spokes give these wheels a whole different look. And what he was trying to do was save weight. You can see other areas on the car that he drilled holes in it, trying to save every ounce that he could. And to my knowledge, they're the only ones that have ever been done like that. So just another neat detail, another home-brewed detail of this particular car. So another interesting detail about the history of this car is that even though Bobby spent tons of time building this thing and engineering it, doing all this work, he never drove this car on the drag strip. He always had friends that drove it for him. So Mike Davis was one of his neighbors and a Mopar guy and a buddy. He drove the car for him, and several other guys in the area drove this car for him through the years. And it was a pretty consistent car. Again, it's lightweight and relatively mild as far as the engine and transmission combination goes. It was geared for the 8th mile, so it had 513 gears, and with those 32-inch tall tires, it was just right going through the 8th mile. And even though we don't have any real records as far as what this car ran, my guess is that it easily ran in the 6s in the 8th mile, and you could probably slow it down to run like a 7.0 index class. This car's most recent configuration was done in the 1990s, and to my knowledge, this car was last run over 20 years ago. So it was stashed away in the dry, but it was definitely not something they were getting out and racing on a very regular basis. So one of my favorite stories that Steve shared with me about this car came long before the car was ever built. And he said that he and his now wife, Kim, they've been married for well over 40 years now. When they first started dating, he didn't see much of Bobby. Kim was still living at home, but he didn't see Bobby because he worked second shift at a local factory. Well, they both shared an interest in old Corvettes because Bobby was working with a guy on fixing wrecked Corvettes, and Steve had just bought a '62 Corvette. So one night, as they're just talking about Corvettes, Bobby asked Steve if the car still had the old 4-speed shifter in it. Well, Bobby went to the other room and brought out a brand new old stock shifter for his car. They went back and forth, and Steve decided that he was going to give him $200 for this, which, think about it, this is like 1980-ish. $200 was a lot of money. That $200 that Steve paid for the shifter is what Bobby used to go buy the Plymouth Arrow body out of a local junkyard. And the best news of all is that Steve still has the '62 Corvette, and that new old stock shifter is still in the car to this day. Unfortunately, Bobby passed away in November of 2020, and the car had been sitting for quite a while anyways, and his wife Joyce didn't know exactly what to do with it moving forward because she didn't have much use for it, and she knew that somebody somewhere could use this car. And so she relied on her son-in-law, Steve, who I'd been contacting to facilitate the sale of this car. And they knew right off the bat that this car was not going to bring top dollar because it needed lots of updates. It needed a set of tires. It probably needed some brake work. It needed new harnesses. It needed plenty of updates as far as safety and just regular wear items. But it was still a very cool car and a very functional car, just like it was. So when Steve got in touch with me about bringing it to my swap meet, he didn't really mention a price or anything like that. But after I got there and we talked through it and everything, he made me an exceptional price on this car. And I'm so thankful that Steve opened up to me about this car and told me all the history, gave me a tour of the car, showed it to me, let me hear it run. You know, he really went above and beyond because he wanted me to own the car. One of the most difficult decisions I've ever had to make in terms of car stuff. I've had to make plenty of hard decisions as far as life stuff is concerned. But when it comes to cars, I play around with a lot of stuff. I buy and sell and trade. I don't waste money on cars, but I do spend plenty. And this came at a really tough time financially for me. There had been some pretty serious medical bills racked up, and I knew those were coming due pretty quickly. Taxes were coming up soon. Christmas was coming up soon. It was not the time for me to buy a race car. It's been a year since I told Steve no, that I was going to pass on the car. And Steve even gave me some time. He gave me some time to think about it. He was not upset about it, even though he wanted me to own the car. After he gave me all the time in the world, he ended up listing this car on Facebook Marketplace, and he listed it for $8,500. And within an hour, he had a dozen people who had committed to come get the car. And he gave it to the person that was first in line. It was a guy from Middle Tennessee. He came over and bought the car, paid him the money, and before he even had it home to Middle Tennessee, it was back on the marketplace again. And it was heartbreaking for me to see this car get away. Even though I let it go away, I could have made a quick $5,000 on this car. But that's not what I wanted to do. I was not going to take advantage of Joyce or Steve or the situation or the fact that they were giving me a good deal because they wanted me to own the car. I was not going to do that. I was not going to buy this car with intentions of selling it. It was going to be a keeper, just like a lot of my cars, because I'd already kind of bonded with it. I'd already had this sentimental feeling about it. And sometimes decisions come from our heart, sometimes they come from our mind, and sometimes they come from our wallet. But in the case of this car, I regret not buying it. I'm just sitting here kind of emotional about it right now because I didn't buy it. But I know why I didn't. And it didn't take long because he sold the car in February, and in March, just a month later, I found my dream car, the 51 Henry J that checks all the boxes for me. It has the perfect stance. It has everything that I ever wanted in a Henry J. And had I bought that Plymouth Arrow, number one, I wouldn't have had the space for the car indoors. And number two, I wouldn't have had the money. I had to make the best decision for me and my family, and that comes before any of these old cars. So in the case of this Plymouth Arrow, it's the one that got away. So I wanted to be able to tell this car's story. I wanted to be able to share my story about this car and share some of those neat details about it. I mean, this thing was built from the ground up, from a hard-working dude in North Georgia. And, you know, even though he's gone, this car lives on. And it absolutely breaks my heart that I couldn't help it live on in its complete and original form. But I want to say a sincere thank you to Steve, to Joyce, to Kim for, you know, putting their heads together and making this available to me. You know, they made a killer price for me, and you know, they wanted me to own it. And I appreciate that. I appreciate all the stories, all the information. You know, it really puts all the pieces together on this really special car. So I'm sad that I didn't buy it, but I'm happy that I learned about it and that I was able to see it and become friends with Steve. I mean, I think that we cross paths for a reason, and I'm just thankful for that. And if you like this sort of video, you can click here to watch another one of my videos about an old drag car. I love this stuff. I love old drag cars. I love history. I love old hot rods. And if you love that kind of stuff, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Give me a thumbs up and feel free to leave a comment below. Thanks for watching.